YOLO composing gloves here, and today we're going to be talking about what is phase. Quick reminder, there's a book for free in the description that has everything I'm going to say and many additional details. That's again for free. Download it at your own leisure. Spent a lot of time working on this particular chapter. So phase is the starting point of a wave, but phase is really what describes frequency. So it's a little confusing. Phase is one of those things that you kind of have to take a math class and a physics class and some signals if you really want to begin to appreciate what phase actually is. In audio, we often look at it as just the starting point of a wave. And the reason we do that, let's just start with the easy sort of not full definition, and then we'll dive into the full definition. So let's say that I have two recordings, and they were both on the same mic, but one mic was a little bit further from the same sound source. So we have a sound source making some sound, and then the sound came from the sound source into the first mic, but it took a bit longer to get in the second mic because that's a bit further away. And since it's the same sound source, both microphones will produce signals that look very similar, ideally the same. One might be a little reduced in amplitude because it's further away, and the sound will lose a bit of power as it travels to the additional mic, but it's not really significant. And so it reaches there, and we record two waveforms. However, in reality, one of these waveforms will be a little bit off, like just a smidge off, according to how far away it was, right? And so what ends up happening is, I want to be able to zoom in further here. Okay, so I've just zoomed in a bit further. What ends up happening is we see here before, we can add frequencies vertically down. So we say, okay, well this here it is, and if we come up right here, but at this moment in time, I don't know if I can select it, but at this moment in time, we see that the other wave is just getting started. So it's not subtracting or adding because we start at 0, but right here we reach a negative, right? And over here, we're going down, so this is all okay. But let's just say the phase shift was a little bit more severe. So now we're going down, this one's beginning to go up, and when we reach here, we're going down. And so things are gonna begin to cancel each other out. And it's all gonna happen at all these different frequencies. Like, it's a really complicated thing, but we could say that, oh, well, the starting point of the wave was different, their phase was different, and as a result, we get what we call as phasing. So if I remove this and first play for you what it sounds like, here's the original. Now let's turn on the other one, and it sounds the same, right? Because if we were to have recorded this from a mic, it would sound the same. But if we put them together, we get phasing, which is that sort of thin texture. And that's when in audio, we generally care about this type of phasing, because when we're recording, where you place mics is going to be really important. And if it comes up in the mix, one thing we could do is we can pull out plugins that will shift things very slowly, or you could come in and do it manually and get it to line up so that they are in phase and the sound will be proper. So it will delay one to match up with the other one. And it sounds proper again, just like the original. So we want things to be in phase. But this is when our two waveforms are correlated, and also this isn't the entire picture. So let's go ahead and dive into what is phase in sort of a different sense. So phase is often called a phase angle. Now I know I just pulled open a graph, and graphs scare people. Don't be scared of this graph. Don't worry about the numbers. We're going to be looking at this purely from a conceptual idea. So we talked a little bit how frequency can be described as a circle with a triangle spinning around in it. We looked at that a bit in the frequency video. Well, it turns out that we wanted to give a name to this particular angle. So if I move A, we see that as sine waves, it begins to get drawn, and that's because we're going around this circle, right? And we wanted to give a name to this particular point. So like right for this particular angle, we have this particular amplitude. And so we wanted to say, well, hey, how do we describe that? Well, one way we could describe it is by naming this angle here. So we did, and we called it the phase. So this is the phase angle that produces this particular output. So right, we put this angle in and we will get this output out. That's the idea, okay? So every single point on the sine wave can be described by some angle, and that's what we call the phase. So the first point has a starting point of 0 for a sine wave of this case. And that's typically how we look at it, right? We say, oh, well, the phase is the starting point, but it's also every single other point. And we see here that before we looked at how high the graph was as a amplitude, and we sort of quantified what amplitude was because, right, we don't hear this as no volume. We end up hearing the entire sine wave and averaging it. But when we talk about phase, we typically don't bring up this averaging. We talk about it very specifically as in accordance with the wave that we're dealing with, the waveform. And so if we call this amplitude, we actually, when we talk about amplitude at a point like this, we call it instantaneous amplitude. And when we talk about phase at a point like this, we call it instantaneous phase. And we can say here, now this is the kicker, as our amplitude, or in other words, as our phase progresses, we produce a frequency. And so we can say this really crazy statement that the progression of phase is frequency. Just like if I were to say, what's your speed? Well, you might not know what your speed is, but we can describe speed as how fast you're changing position, or the progression of position is velocity. It's very similar because they're both related by a similar concept. In math, we call it a derivative. But as something changes, and in the case of position, as position changes, that change in position we call a speed or a velocity. And over here we have amplitude changing. And when we talk about amplitude changing being described by some angle, we call that phase. And so as phase progresses, we get a frequency. So phase is a lot more than just the starting point of a wave. That being said though, when we come in here, it's often taught like that, and it's often taught like that's the only thing it is. So now you know that it's not. But let's go ahead, dive in here, and we say, okay, here is a frequency coming up and down, and I'm able to change the amplitude of this frequency, but it doesn't show it unless I have a second harmonic. So I'm gonna add a slight second harmonic, and if I bring it down, I'm able to change the amplitude of this. And this is a normalized graph, but you begin to see the second harmonic showing up. So this is the volume. I just wanted you to know what the top bar did. And the bottom bar controls the phase. So if we move this bottom bar, we would expect the sine wave to change. So if I move this, we see it changes where it starts. And why does it change where it starts? Well, it changes where it starts because we're giving it a different input. We're saying, hey, start here instead. So it starts there. And we can control any place that we want this particular sine wave to start, right? If we look at here, we see that I'm just scrolling along. And this is what's called a phase shift. So a phase shift and phase. And this is true for very, very complex signals. So here's a complex signal, and we learned last time that we can take a complex signal and say, what's the frequency? Well, the frequency, you can't really see it here. Let's open this up in Edison and zoom in really close to one piece of this, because you might be going, where is frequency on this? Well, we could say, well, we have this big waveform, like we can see this fundamental here, but then there's all these little movements, and those little movements are tiny, very high frequencies with a small amplitude, and they add all together. If you were to add all those frequencies up, you'd get back this original signal. Well, each one of those individual frequencies also has a particular phase. And so there's also all the phase of every single one of these frequencies. And you can actually get a graph. This is one that we don't use that often in audio for what we do, but you will if you get into more technical areas of audio, where you can get a phase plot and you can see how phase will be affected as opposed to frequency. And you might be going, why do we care about phase other than this beginning portion with the phase? Well, we notice now that when we move the phase, there is a direct correspondence to the amplitude at that point. So if I were to come in here and move this just a smidge over, I have now changed the amplitude at every single one of these points. And it's because it's like I took every single frequency in the signal and did a phase shift to it. So when we move an entire signal like this, it's called a phase shift. And if we actually go over to the calculator, I'm going to open up a new Desmos. And oh, my connection is working again. Great. So if I were to graph sine x, where x is our input, we see we get a sine wave. And if I want to be able to slide this sine wave around, just like I was sliding our wave earlier in time, I could add a plus a, where a is the phase shift. And I'm able to scroll along. And so when we move an entire signal around and keep everything else the same, that's called the phase shift. So this is like, oh look, it's a phase shift basically. Now it gets really crazy if frequency begins to change. So if instead I have another thing in here, let's say I add B, and now B controls the frequency. You're just gonna have to take my word for it. I'll show you. See, we have a changing frequency. So if I have frequency in phase changing at the same time, things start getting kind of dense and kind of complicated. And in real life, signals are not very simple. They have things that change over time. Things are moving. Some frequencies will phase cancel with others and some won't. And when I say phase cancel, let's make that really clear. So we have this idea of constructive interference and deconstructive interference. So here's citrus, and it's making a sine wave. There's our sine wave, it's beautiful. Now let's say I go over to the second oscillator, and I want to make another sine wave, but I want this to be 180 degrees out of phase. Now, what's this 180 degree business? Well, that's where the angle thing comes in. So here I had a waveform, it starts at 0 degrees. Well, if I let that progress, it'll go up and down like this. But if instead I had a waveform, let's actually do it here. Okay, so I've got two sine waves. They're on top of each other. You can't see them. One's red, one's purple. Right now they're in what's called radians. Don't worry about radians. I'll talk about it as if I'm in degrees, but you're gonna see me typing things that are not degrees, they're radians, which is why they're different. But here I've got a sine wave, it's at sine x. And if I have plus, and then I'm going to do a phase shift, right? Because we just talked about how this is a phase shift. I'm gonna add pi, which is 180 degrees. And we get this mess. And if we look at this, well, if these were amplitudes and we were to add them together, which is what would happen, we'd see here that we start at 0, they both start at 0, and then we go to 180 degrees. Well, this one's going down while this one's going up. And so they'll cancel each other at every point, and we'll end up getting nothing out of our speaker. So if we go into our thing here, we say, okay, I'm gonna open this up, and I'm going to give this one, I'm gonna try and give it a phase shift of 180 degrees. So that's pretty close. And if I try playing a note, oh, we need to put it out. So as I turn this up, the volume will decrease, because as these two waveforms add together, they'll cancel each other out, because while one's going up, one's going down, and they are said to phase cancel. Okay, so Citrus does not update when I turn the volume up on this knob, but I will turn this knob's volume up instead. So right now, this operator is making no noise, and as I turn it up, it will begin to make a frequency that will cancel with this frequency, because again, while this one goes down, this one goes up. So let's hear that. And so you can see that's going to be a big deal if you have phasing in your signal, because some frequencies are going to just disappear. Now we have the other problem, which is when they are in phase, we get what's called constructive interference. Now usually it's not a problem. Usually you want in phase. What we have here is, so we just simply adjust this so that when this wave is going up, this wave is going up, and they'll add together and they will get louder at that point. So for example, if I had a signal that was going up and it reached a value of 1, and I had another signal that was going up and it also reached a value 1 and it matched the first one, when I put them together, I'll get a new signal. I'll superimpose them, fancy word for adding together, and I will get a signal whose amplitude reaches 2. So I'll have 2 there. And so here, if I play a note and I turn this up, we'd expect our signal to actually get louder. And you can see it does pick up quite a bit. And so that is constructive and deconstructive interference. In different situations, you're gonna want different amounts of each. And in sound design, phasing is very useful. So that is phase in a nutshell. Now, you notice we didn't have an exact cancellation when I had them 180 degrees out of phase. If they were perfectly 180 degrees out of phase, they would perfectly cancel. It's not very common. Usually things will partially construct and partially deconstruct each other. And so when we look at this, if I slide this over, if I slide one over but not the other, there is no way I'm going to get everything to cancel because they're not mirror, there's not mirror images. They don't repeat like this. And since they don't repeat like this, I can't get it to phase cancel like that. So we get a thin sound when things are out of phase and a more full sound when things are in phase, or a thick with 2 C's. You know what I'm saying? So if I move this around, we'll get all sorts of interesting results. Like these don't, like that didn't even sound like the same friggin' thing. Where this get? That sounds like a different note. So phasing can be a pretty big deal. But if I move it around, we go back to our, and right there what probably happened is the particular frequency we were causing to phase cancel was probably the lowest frequency, which we learned is the one that our ears rely on to tell what the proper note we're hearing is. So our ear, when we heard that, because that was removed, we had a way harder time hearing the original note that the sound probably is actually at. So this opens up all sorts of really cool abilities. In fact, I want to show you an example where a phase shift makes a really big difference. Here it is. This is a really old track I did way back several years ago called Killer Ladybugs. But at the beginning, I have this bass sound. And one of the things you can see I'm messing with is something called unison phase. Now, I'm not going to dive into sound design or anything here, but I want to show you the impact that messing with phase can have. So it starts off with this like really groovy bass line thing. Here it is. So right there, I want to focus in at this part, but you get the idea. It's this thing that's moving around. And so let's just listen to this and hear what it sounds like. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a lot more severe. And let's just see how it sounds. It sounds completely different. Like if I just do that, suddenly those are like canceled and it's like really, you get this weird space sensation. But if I move this down, they interfere in different ways, and so you don't get that same sound at all. So when you're doing sound design, sometimes you specifically hunt for a phase that works. And there's almost always one particular value that will cause a significant impact, and that's usually the one that affects the lowest frequency. I'm just gonna call it the fundamental from now on, the lowest frequency the most. So that's what's going on here though, is I'm just finding a phase relationship that I really like. And this is actually phase that is moving. So I'm changing the phase value of what I have here. So here it is, you can actually see it. And that's what's going on. So a lot of effects will use phase to do interesting things. It's also really important for things like reverb. So phase can occur acoustically. Let me really quick show you what I mean. I'm gonna load up a citrus. So here is a citrus. I'm gonna make it play just pure frequencies. And we're gonna output a frequency of, I don't know, 60 hertz, why not? And I want this to be pretty loud. I gotta remember to not save any of these changes. Otherwise I'm gonna regret it. So I'm just gonna turn this up. And what I want you to do, I'm gonna have it play for like 20, 30 seconds, maybe just like 10 seconds, because I'm not that patient. You can try this on your own. And I'm gonna play it, and I want you to get up and walk around your room. And you'll notice that at some parts of your room, you're gonna hear this thing really loud, and that's because you're standing in a spot where the pressure wave has a standing wave, and it's going to be loud at that spot, like just where it sits, it'll be loud. And you'll notice that at other spots in your room, it'll be very soft, and that's because you're standing in one of these nodes here. So let's go ahead and play it. Just walk around and give your room a listen, see what it sounds like. And okay, nowhere near 10 seconds, but you get the idea. And you can set this up easily. If you don't have FL, just download the demo and try it out. Just set up the things exactly as you saw me do. I just turned it on, went to default, make sure you turn your ratio off and turn this up to whatever value. Just have it play a note, and you can walk around and hear your room at different frequencies. And what you're hearing here is, in the case of a single wave, you're hearing the properties of a wave's phase. You're not hearing phasing yet because we're not playing two signals. If you walk around your room and you hear a soft point, it means you're standing at a point where the particular phase of the wave was at a 0. And then if you were at a maximum or a minimum, then that will be a loud point in the room. And each room will have standing waves. You can design rooms so that to avoid these standing waves. And so depending on where you are in the room will change what you're hearing. This becomes less and less of a problem for a bunch of reasons as your frequencies get higher. But for low frequencies, it's particularly problematic. And we'll deal with those sorts of problems later, but they're directly related to phase. And so phase is something that occurs acoustically as well. So if I have one pressure wave over here and it's at a high, let me move my hand on the screen, and then another pressure wave that's low, when they meet, they'll cancel each other out and you won't hear anything. And so that can happen acoustically. However, acoustics brings in physics, and physics is never that straightforward. It never in real life. It's never that easy. So I'm gonna do something a bit different here. I'm gonna have one wave and then set up a second wave to be 180 degrees out of phase with it. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set it up here, and I can actually get perfect cancellation by just outputting it backwards. So what this does is when it goes out this way, it's outputting the phase in the direction you think. When it goes out this way, it's going to flip what's called the polarity. So the polarity is basically the plus is plus and the minus is minus. And if you flip the polarity, it's like you flip the wave. That's another really common way to fix phasing, is you might just try flipping the polarity. FL actually has a reverse polarity button. And if we look here, we're just flipping it. So this was up, now it's down. And that can often fix things as well. Really common trick. If you're at a console, there's usually a button for polarity flip, and you can do that. But here, what we're gonna use it for is to perfectly phase cancel these two waves. So if I play the note, nothing. And actually, if I turn one down, we see it comes back. I could have done that earlier, but one of the reasons is I forgot. And the second reason is it almost never happens like that in real life anyway. So it's better to see how it really is gonna work. But here we've set it up to specifically cancel each other out. And now what we're gonna do is I'm going to send one out the left channel and one out, or I said that backwards, one out the right channel, one out the left channel. And your ear, if you're wearing headphones, it's gonna be a completely different experience too. And there's lots of people who do weird stuff with surround sound using some of these ideas. But now one will be out of phase in one ear and in phase in the other ear. And if you're hearing it over headphones, you're gonna hear it like fine, but it's still gonna be a weird experience. But if you're listening over monitors, then, well, if you're listening over, okay, this is like, it gets really complicated. You see, I can't even finish a sentence here. Okay, let's just pretend you're listening over your phone and it's got one speaker. They will sum together in mono and they'll still phase cancel. So you won't get the effect because it's summing it together into one channel in order to output it over your one speaker, so it won't work. If you're listening over headphones, it'll go in one ear and then it will go in the other ear with the opposite polarity, and your brain will know something's weird, but you will have a hard time telling because of the way we average loudness and things. And if you think about it, that's really important. It just goes to show that we don't hear instantaneous phase. But instantaneous phase can really affect us because if we're listening over monitors, one will be in phase, one will be out of phase. The phasing will occur acoustically before it gets to your ears, and then you're going to hear that phasing. And so the effect will be dramatically different. And so if I go ahead and play that, it's just a weird experience. Let me play it. And you can set this up on your own, just do the exact same thing. In this case, it's just important that the frequencies are the same. But you can do this with a lot of things. I mean, what I could do earlier is like, let's say I record this bass, I could take it, flip the polarity so it's perfectly out of phase, and then I could pan them differently and create this really weird effect. But it would only be audible over a stereo mix. because if you're listening over mono, it gets some to mono and it'll cancel. If you're listening over headphones, it'll be well, the effect won't be near the same because your ears will average it and hear it independently. But if it's occurring acoustically, it'll be there. So it gets kind of different here. And this brings up, if you do a mix, if you're using techniques that rely on creating stereo width by taking the sound and delaying it from one speaker to the other. So let's say I've got my sound coming out of one speaker and then it comes out of the other speaker a split second later, it's going to sound really different. And it's one of the main reasons why you want to mix over both headphones and monitors. If the majority of your audience is listening over headphones, effects that rely on delays between speakers are going to be largely lost to your audience, where over the speaker too, over little phones or anything that's mono. But if you're listening over speakers, it will produce an awesome effect where things will sound really wide and really full. And so you just want to be careful with the techniques you're using. And so there's your reason for that. So let's go ahead, and if I was playing this, let's say that I had like a rad vocal, or let's just do it here with this guy right here. So I've got my crazy bass sound. You can see the stereo channels are already quite aggressive. Let's go to somewhere where I've already got right there. And this was before I really knew what mixing was. So this is kind of a mess. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a slight delay between the two channels, and I already have a stereo shaper up. I'm so proud of the old me. Stereo shaper. So we're gonna add this, and we can see we can put a delay and we can put a different phase between the two speakers. So this is kind of now you kind of know what this phase knob's there for, changing the space. We're stereo shaping. It's kind of cool. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn this knob, and it's gonna create a delay between the two speakers. And when this delay is really, really short, like we see it's 3.3 milliseconds or whatever, that's called a Haas delay. And there's a bunch of things we'll talk about later with delays. But here it is. Sounds like it's just in a totally different spot. Now over the headphones, the effect will be different, but because the way we also use the law of the first wavefront, I'm throwing out all these laws now. The law of the first wavefront basically just says that wherever the first wavefront hits your ear, that's where you're gonna perceive the sound is coming from. And so it still kind of works over headphones because it hits my ear on one side first, and that allows me to localize the sound, or to place the sound in a space. It's called the law of the first wavefront because it turns out that if you were to change things over time slowly using a couple of techniques, you can actually get it so that it's coming out of one speaker, but people still hear it like it's coming out of a different speaker. So we're gonna dive into those things later. It's called psychoacoustics, and we can do all sorts of nifty things with them. And it's psycho because the sound's no longer coming from one spot, it's coming from a different spot. But we've tricked you. It's in your head. You think it's coming somewhere else. What you think and what the world is doing are different. But anyways, you can see a delay here creates an effect. That's pretty dang cool and useful for spatial positioning. And we can also just create a general phase difference. And then notice the phase difference, it sounds different, but it's a lot harder to hear really over the headphones, where the delay was easier because of the law of the first wavefront that I just explained. And that is phase. So we've covered now the big three. We've got frequency, phase, and amplitude. And by combining these things, we have the ability to create any frequency, because we could take frequencies and add them together. Each frequency will have a phase, and we can really look at phase, the progression of phase as frequencies. So there's this sort of duality between frequency and phase. And then amplitude is in there as well. So let's really quick, just to wrap it up, when we look at a waveform, I'm hoping you're able to take away a lot more of what it is you're looking at. So if I were to zoom in here, and in FL Studio, if you want to zoom in further, there's this thing called pulse per quarter note. If you go into project, time-based PPQ, pulse per quarter, you can actually set it a lot higher. It does take significantly more processing because you're working with like basically a higher resolution. But if we zoom in here, this is speech, so it's gonna look kind of crazy. Let's open this up. So we can see here now, what kind of information can we gather from this graph? Here we can gather that we have some low frequency and some high frequency. we can sort of guess where phase cancellation occurs because we have these sort of funny offsets. And then we can also see like, oh, there's some high frequencies, but the low frequency is clearly significantly louder. Like look at the deviation caused by the low frequency versus the high frequencies, which cause deviations around wherever the low frequency told it to be. So like, right, low frequency comes in and says, hey, it should be this loud here. And then the high frequencies are making all these like tiny adjustments. And we're able to guess at frequency by how often this happens. So if these were like more squished together, we'd say it's high. That's how we know these fuzzy lines we can't even zoom into are high frequencies. And if I were to open this up in an Edison and zoom way in, we can actually see these really, really small deviations caused by the high frequencies that are occurring all over the place. So I also wanted to show you what a vector scope is. And let's really quick look at that. Let's use it on the same channel we put that stereo shaper. So I'm going to open up a vector scope. And if you have wave candy, you have a vector scope. So we're going to open up that. So we can actually, I'm going to resize this a bit. I'm going to get rid of the name. And I'm going to make the background not transparent. And I'm going to set it to vector scope. And what the vector scope says is, if you see stuff in the middle here, that means the sound is constructively interfering. If you see stuff in the middle down here, constructively interfering is just on the negative cycle. If you see stuff between these lines, so in this region or this region, that means they are not constructively interfering. They are deconstructively interfering. And as a result, you will hear a reduction. And that could be really, that's where the experience becomes significantly different via the medium you're listening over. So I'm going to move this down here and I'm going to open up the stereo shaper so we can mess with things. And let's just go ahead and play it and see what our vector scope tells us about the stereo image. So you see it's moving all around. I designed the sound that way to just be nuts. So it's over here for sometimes, but it's mostly in the in phase area. So let's actually, it might be better to do this with a sound that's not so dang insane, but let's go ahead and change the phase and see what we get. Yeah, this one's too crazy. It's moving around so much that it's not gonna have a real, it's not gonna be real clear what I'm trying to show. So I'm going to open up again a citrus. Okay, so I've set it up now with a citrus. It's gonna be just a bit more straightforward what I'm trying to show. And we see here that we are just up and down a straight line, and that's because they are perfectly in phase. Now, if I take one of these and begin to change its phase and sum them together. Now, it's also straight up and down because we're mono. And so I'm going to take one and route it out the left and one out the right. And when we do this, we still get a straight line. But as I begin to change the phase, we'll see an ellipse and eventually a circle. So here we have pretty much a circle. And it makes sense, right? That's just saying that over this region, it's in phase and it goes out of phase. And that's just because of the way we've delayed the two signals. Here we have it. And as I move the phase, I can change this thing. And as I get closer and closer to out of phase, we will see it form a horizontal line because it'll be perfectly out of phase. See, it's somewhere there in the middle. Is the most out of phase. Oh, there we go. Right there, look at that. Ooh, so close, so close. And that, again, I have to hear it over left, right. So over your headphones, it doesn't sound like it's very out of phase. But if I put this back in mono, that's our result. So pretty interesting. That's what a vector scope shows you. So if you play music through this and you see stuff in the middle, it's good mono compatibility. You're going to be a bit on the safer side. You have a lot of stuff here. Now, there are techniques called mid-side, which processes stuff that would be the same between both channels and stuff that would be different between both channels separately. And that could be a real handy way of sidestepping this issue with phase and mono and all this other stuff. That's a topic for another day. If you have any questions, let me know. A bit more of a technical, longer video. Subscribe, download the book, and let me know your thoughts. And also, donations are deeply appreciated because this stuff just takes a long time to write out nicely. And have a blessed day.